Welcome back to Murder with Friends. We're jumping back in with Charles Manson. Now we're going to take it from the 1960s, where we have Charles Manson as an aspiring cult leader and musical superstar. So just to kick this off, let's take a listen to one of Charles Manson's songs. This song is called Look at Your Game Girl, and Jack and I are going to respond a little bit.
There's a time for living.
Voice.
He can sing, yeah. He's not an incredible. He's a great cult leader, not the best singer, not the best songwriter.
But this, like, it picks up.
Yeah, no, it's
I
a
had
good song.
this stuck in my head.
You have been singing it all.
Yeah, wait till we get to the hook.
Look at your game, girl.
It's such a good song.
This sounds a lot like your music, actually, which unsettles me.
It's a great title, too.
No, it's good. I mean, a lot of his music is good. It's not anything spectacular, and that's why he couldn't get in the Beach Boys.
Right,
like, but they were like, oh, this is a cool idea.
Yeah.
But
you bring up a really interesting part of his life, which was when he and Dennis Wilson, he kind of forced his way into Dennis Wilson, member of the Beach Boys' life with his cult.
Yeah.
And you do know the story about how Dennis Wilson met Charles Manson for the first time?
Tell us, Grace.
Okay, I wasn't. Some people know it. It's actually a kind of common story if you pay attention to murder. So what happened was Dennis Wilson had met one of Charles Manson's girls and had invited her over, and Charles Manson was then told that they were in at the Dennis Wilson mansion or whatever, and they threw a big party. Dennis Wilson comes home, and there's this party going on at his house, and then Charles Manson comes out in a bathrobe, and I think he just in his underwear and a bathrobe, all 5'2" of him, and was just like, hey, what's up? I'm Charles Manson, and just had descended on the Wilson household. Yeah.
It's such a wild story. His like interaction with the music industry and really trying to be famous. The goal for him was fame and accolade and claim. It wasn't murder. A lot of serial killers are just like obsessive about murder. Manson didn't really give a shit about that. He just wanted to be known, and he wanted love in the wrong way, but he wanted to be larger than life.
Certainly not at first.
Yeah.
He really did want to join this inner circle, and he felt like he was getting signs from Dennis Wilson and from his friends in the music industry that this was a possibility, because, you know, the Beach Boys actually used one of his songs, the skeleton version of one of his songs, on a later record after Pet Sounds, because I know that you're a big Beach Boys.
Smile?
I think it was on Smile, I'm not sure, but they used just sort of an idea of one of his songs, but he kind of gives it a little bit more credit than it is.
Yeah.
Doesn't actually sound like the same sort of thing.
Yeah, like you have friends where they like say something funny and then you write a joke about that, and it's not their joke, you know, because they couldn't get it from that idea to something genuinely funny.
Right.
And Manson couldn't make that distinction because he was such an egomaniac.
Right. He couldn't make those connections on his own. Through the music industry, he met Terry Melcher. And I want to bring up Terry Melcher because Terry Melcher was a record guy, a record producer, manager, and he played a really large role, I think, in the Manson murders because he used to live at the house on Cielo Drive where the murders eventually took place. And as far as Manson knew, when he ordered his followers out there, Terry Melcher still lived there, and Terry Melcher had previously rejected Manson, you know, signing Manson, and that a lot of people link to Manson being set off.
Yeah.
And I think there's got to be a connection there. You know, it wasn't random.
I mean, it is the way that we look at murderers, are like the present psychological understanding is you have a genetic predisposition to being a murderer, lower empathy, blah, blah, blah. I don't know enough of the science. Then you have intense childhood trauma, which Manson had in spades. And then you have a moment where you go from feeling a part of the world to being isolated from it. And that moment, which could have been this, where he is denied the very thing he wants most of all, and the thing that connects him to other people is music and talking and reaching people on an emotional level, he's then denied.
Yeah.
And then in short order, he becomes the Charles Manson that we now fear instead of was some weird hippie cult leader.
Yeah, and we see in the 1960s that he burns a bunch of these bridges. Most notably, Dennis Wilson kicked out the Manson family. It was a small family at that point in time, but he kicked them out of his house and kind of said, I don't really want anything to do with you anymore. And it makes me wonder, since he never had a stable male figure in his life, do you think that that is why he never cultivated any lasting male friendships? I mean, even with Tex Watson, one of his followers, he doesn't really have a lot of male friends, you know?
I think that's absolutely true. One of the big issues that it seemed like Manson had would prevent him from forming like male bond outside of prison. Like that's how he grew up. That's how he learned most of his social interaction. You're not going to forge those useful male friendships that might have helped him from becoming this person. Like every man that he was around pushed him away because he was such a psychopath.
Yeah, and we see that the way that Manson tried to connect with people was through stunts and through becoming this sort of larger-than-life cult leader. One of my favorite stories about this is that he's on the beach. I think it was around when he was still living with Dennis Wilson, and they were on the beach in California, and some guy was listening to him sort of preach his philosophy, his teachings to these girls who were eating it all up. And he was talking about how we don't need possessions, and it's this free love lifestyle. And, you know, this guy goes up to him and he says, hey, you know, you're talking about how you don't need possessions. Well, I couldn't help but notice this huge bus that you have with all these things on there. You know, what's up with that? And Charles Manson just tosses the guy the keys. He's like, it's yours now. And the guy drove the bus and then came back, but he just couldn't believe that that Manson was actually sort of the real deal. And it seems like Manson would do these crazy stunts to connect with people, but as far as the actual relationships and not trashing Dennis Wilson's house and, you know, not making Terry Melcher super uncomfortable and not starting fights at a record label and showing up without shoes, all that stuff he couldn't grasp.
I think it's not necessarily his inability to grasp it. It's having the abandonment issues that he had with every male figure in his life. A lot of people that have been abused like that will push the people that they love as far away as possible so that they come back to say, like, if you really love me, you can handle this. If you really love me, you can handle this.
Yeah.
And eventually people do snap, especially if it's not blood. And Manson's obsession with pushing people away, especially male figures in his life, was essentially being like, I want that paternal love. That unconditional love, and he's trying to find it, and that's not possible.
Well, and especially when there wasn't a sort of physical intimacy there, which he didn't really have with the men, whereas the girls, he could push them away, but the girls were so bonded to him through their dependency on the drugs that he would provide them, and also through the pphysical intimacy that he provided, which is actually kind of a nice segue to take us to Charles Manson, the girls, and the family. And I'm going to throw some pictures your way about these girls and what they looked like at the time, because I want to talk about what sort of the commonalities were with these girls.
We have similar haircuts, actually.
Well, I was going to say, I think, and I've heard this before, Manson had a type.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you would venture to describe that type, but to me, it's sort of these transient women looking for stability, very young. A lot of the girls were about, 20 years his junior.
Yeah.
And, there weren't any strong parental figures for them to answer to.
Yeah, I think the girls are what really makes this such an interesting story, is we have this, like, the corruption of American youth type concept, and we want these girls to be good people, and we want them to be, like, corrupted by Manson, when really they had no homes, they ran away from home, they ran away from their lives, and got mixed up with a guy who was clearly selling something, was clearly offering something to the broken, and that's what these girls were. Even to this day, when you watch interviews of them, it's very clear that they were permanently damaged before Manson, and they were drawn into that.
So you think, I don't think this is a stretch to say he took advantage of them.
Yeah, they're definitely. Yeah, we can use that turn of phrase. I think finding emotionally vulnerable people and then bringing them into a cult is taking advantage of them.
Yeah, and let's talk about this cult, because I think that we hear a lot about Manson's cult, but let's talk a little bit about what the beliefs were that he was, preaching to his followers. And a lot of it was loyalty to him, above all, was just, loyalty to him. But also he believed in that a race war was coming. And this became a later belief. This wasn't in the early stages of the cult, but eventually it became very clear.
That was pretty clear, like in the American zeitgeist, was huge racial tensions at the time.
Because of the riots.
Yeah, I was saying this to you earlier when we were talking about it, but we look at Manson and be like, he wanted to start a race war. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. America was pretty ready to have a race war at the end of the 60s. Like the hippie movement is done.
Yeah.
There is tension in the streets. There's Molotov cocktails going through windows all over this country after 6 years of talking about peace and love and flowers in your hair.
But I feel like Manson took it such a step further, because with Helter Skelter, so we listened to the Beatles' White Album, and he believed that there were messages that were being sent directly from Paul McCartney and John Lennon to him. And actually, the Beatles and the Moody Blues were the only things that they were allowed to listen to when they moved from when they were kicked out of Dennis Wilson's house to Spawn Ranch. And he believed that what this record was saying was that there was going to be a race war, and that the way to go about it was to just let the race war happen, maybe instigate it a little bit, but it was inevitable. It was going to happen anyway. And they were going to hide out in a city in the desert. They had to find the city in the desert, wait for the race war to be over, and then when the race war was over, he felt that the black people would have won, because it was very distinct for him. It was a race between black and white. That was it. And but when they won the race war, they wouldn't be able to lead because they didn't have the experience. And so then they would come out from the desert city underground, and then they would take over and rule the world. Yeah. That was his cult belief.
That was the game plan.
Yeah, and
which is long-term thinking. He
was planning ahead.
He had he set of goals, a 6-month, year-long goal sheet.
But the reason why he started losing followers towards the end, and we see him getting more and more desperate, was because he sent them out into, his followers were out in the desert, limited resources. There's a story about one follower kind of accosted a man, tried to flirt with him, and then ultimately just said, hey, are you going to finish that lunch? Like, it was a girl just like came out of the woods and was like, hey, you want to make out? No? What about that sandwich? Real quick. And they were desperate, and they weren't finding this desert city. Yeah. So a lot of people feel like that, coupled with the rejection of the music industry, made him want to start this race war.
It's Manson, the clear line that he has the entire time is, I want to push my followers as far as I can push them, and I want to be important. Yeah. Which, in my mind, and it's so easy to pathologize serial killers, that all sounds like his childhood, is having no importance and being a burden on his mother, and knowing that he wanted to be great. Yeah. He wanted that feeling.
I think another interesting thing about the whole cult is the selection process behind it, because you have these followers that really fit the mold very well. Obviously, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, they fit the mold perfectly because they were willing to murder for him. There's a story that we talked about a little bit before, and I really want to share it just because it's so bizarrely and morbidly amusing to me, is Angela Lansbury's daughter was very interested, allegedly, in joining the Manson cult. And they let her for a little bit because she was well off with money. And then eventually they realized that she was a little bit too high profile, and she got cut from the cult. And I couldn't help but hear the story and think, I bet I would be cut. You know what I mean? I don't think I would have made I wouldn't have made the cut for the cult. And I don't think of that. I didn't want to. I don't want to murder anyone.
You would get cut just because you would be terrible on LSD. You would just be intolerable on LSD because you would ask everyone if you're seeing what they're seeing.
Yeah, that's true.
For 12 straight hours, and Manson would just be like, "We've got enough brown-haired girls. Just go back to Los Angeles."
Well, and another thing was that a rite of passage to joining was you did have to have sex with Charlie Manson. That was a
big part of it.
Big part of it.
I will always be endlessly impressed at Manson being 5'2" and just having a plethora of women just follow him around. That's
So
I don't think that could happen in the days of Tinder in any capacity. It would be like a picture of Charles Manson, like 5'2", house out in Palm Springs, kind of into religion, mostly just spiritual, and every girl would be like 5'2", no. No.
All right, so before we move on, I want to show you some pictures of the girls then and now, just to kind of see how they've evolved. So here we go. Here's Susan Atkins, then and now, just to see what they're up to these days. And then here is Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia Krenwinkel was the girl in the story that asked for the sandwich of the man. She was very hungry. And then lastly, here is Leslie Van Houten. And Leslie Van Houten was actually recently denied parole. And many of these women were just, were so young, early 20s. Some of them were, I think Leslie was actually maybe 19 when this was all going down, and spending the rest of their lives behind bars. And it's specifically with Leslie, it's upsetting in a weird way to watch interviews with her because she so clearly understands
what she's done, the gravity of it. Yeah.
And it's like, you just threw your whole life away, but she absolutely did take a life. All right, guys, when we come back, we are going to be talking about the murders, what went down, how it went down. So we'll see you after the break.